On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Good evening. My name is Andy Thomas and I am the author of The Truth Agenda, but tonight I am your guest presenter for this edition of On the Edge. And very shortly I will introduce to you the guest that we have with us this evening, but I should just say that if at any time during the programme you want to text in with a message, you can do so, and all you need to do is text the word EDGE followed by a space and then your message to 86686. And hopefully during the programme we'll have some time to read out some of your messages and get our guest here to respond. And also don't forget, this is the main programme, but there is more. If you are a subscriber online, you can watch a little bit more of this programme on Over the Edge, as it's called, on our subscription service. So do check that out if you want to see more. But it is a huge pleasure tonight to introduce to you my guest, and that guest is Marcus Allen. Marcus, good evening.
Good evening, Andy. Good to be here.
It's very nice that you're here, and I should explain to the viewers why you're here, because I was offered basically the opportunity to speak to whoever I felt I had something, you know, that we might have an interesting conversation with, and you immediately came to mind.
Wow.
Now, you know, I will not lie, I have known Marcus for some years, on and off, but that is not to say that there isn't more to know. And for those that don't know who Marcus is, I would say, one of the UK's best-known conspiracy theorists. And when I say that, Marcus, I mean that in a very good sense of the word, because I think we spend a lot of time often trying to pretend that that's not the world that we're in, when probably it is. And as the UK publisher of Nexus magazine, which I'm sure you will explain to us in a moment, well, I think conspiracy theory is certainly one of the things, at the very least, that Nexus deals with. This programme is sponsored by Uncensored magazine, but I'm sure they would be the first to say they were inspired in many ways by Nexus magazine. So tell us a little bit about Nexus magazine and your role in it.
Nexus magazine, it's the world's leading alternative news magazine. Well, that's what we say it is, and nobody has disputed that yet. Nexus actually comes from Australia. That's where it's edited and that's where it's produced. And we publish here in the UK the European UK edition. We put the UK ads in so it's familiar to most European readers. We sell it in 35 countries around the world as well, and we have a readership probably approaching 30,000. There's a lot of people are aware of Nexus magazine. A lot of people are familiar with the content of it, which is looking at the alternative news.
Well, I know that Nexus has inspired many people to set out on the path of what we might call truth-seeking, if we need another word. And certainly, I mean, Nexus has been an inspiration to me, and I would say, you know, your own antics, as it were, have been inspirational, because when you look at the people who have actually got out into the mainstream with this stuff, it's actually not that many, but you have, through your own interests, managed to make it onto everything from Jeremy Clarkson to The One Show, talking about mainly, it must be said, the NASA moon landings, and raising some serious questions about that. Do you play guilty or not guilty?
Definitely guilty on that one. There's a lot of interest in that.
Okay, so I mean, you know, we obviously want to get into your background this evening and get a sense of who you are and where you're coming from. But, you know, just to come to the basics of that particular niche, that questioning of the NASA record, what is it that drew you to want to investigate something like that?
It was an American, actually, who was giving a talk here in England. I happened to go along to it thinking this could be interesting. He was talking about ancient sites and things, and nothing to do with NASA at the time, and he happened to mention during the talk, oh, of course, the Apollo record, I mean, that's very suspicious. You don't want to check it out. I thought, what is he talking about? This is about 15, 20 years ago. prior to that, I thought, well, there's nothing to question, is there? You know, the Americans had done what they said they were going to do, land a man on the moon before the decade is out, which they'd done with Apollo 11. Don't question it. You know, nobody was questioning it. There were a few strange people around who were questioning, you know, things, but then they were the people who were saying that the money should have been spent here on Earth, not up in space, without realizing, of course, that all the money was spent here on Earth, not up in space. And I thought, well, I was a photographer. I was trained as a photographer. I understand cameras. I understand film. I understand what photographs can and cannot do. I'll have a look at these Apollo photographs. I was familiar with them. Now, this was 18 years ago. And to get hold of pictures of Apollo, you had to go and buy postcards, which I did.
That's true.
At an astronomy shop.
Indeed.
And so I bought my half-dozen pack of photographs of Apollo, and I started looking at them, and I thought, oh, I see what he means. Yeah, there are a few strange things. Those photographs shouldn't look like that. They should be different. Given that I then discovered, obviously, the cameras that were used, the film that was used. It's all public knowledge. I've used the same cameras, I've used the same film, and these are not the results I got. And I thought, well, there's something to question here.
I mean, that raises an interesting issue, because what I want to explore to begin with really is your background, and I know that photography was one of a number of things that you did. So let's start with that, because you have a background in photography, which is obviously what drew you to spot, you know, many of these anomalies. Tell me about your career as a photographer.
Well, I started, my interest in photography began when, at the age of 19, I drove to India in a Land Rover, you know, as you do. 1961. This was a long time ago, and my father gave me a camera, a little camera, and said, here you are, take some pictures when you're away, which I did. And the more I took, the more I got interested in photography. When I came back to England about 18 months later, I went to study photography, the technical aspect of photography, at the London College of Printing in South London, where I learnt what cameras can and cannot do from a technical point of view. I didn't want to be taught what pictures to take. That was something that would be decided later, but how to take them and how to get the best result. So I'd done the technical side of photography. I then worked professionally in London for about 5 years in fashion, in advertising, in reporting, in photojournalism. I'd used the Hasselblad cameras that were, as I discovered later, used on Apollo. So I was familiar with what they could do. And as I started looking at the NASA photographs, I got hold of more photographs, and I found books and magazines that had pictures in, because they were published very broadly from 1969 onwards, because obviously America were proud of what they'd achieved, and I thought, good on them. It didn't occur to me at that point to question it. It was only later. And I thought, okay, let's have a look at the anomalies. And that's what I started looking for. And the more I looked, the more I found. And then I discovered there were other people investigating the same things, the same areas, for doing it for their own reasons. No, not for commercial reasons necessarily. They were doing it because they just wanted to get to the truth, as you mentioned at the beginning, truth-seeking. If you're told something and you don't necessarily believe everything you've been told, you're going to have to keep looking until you can find an answer that satisfies you. When you get an answer that satisfies you, great. You can then move forward. Until you get to that point, you just got to keep digging. And that's what I did. I kept digging. And the more I dug, the more I found. And the internet, of course, where you can now access every single photograph ever taken on the lunar surface, is available in high resolution, and you can download it if you want to, you can examine it if you want to, and you can see every detail that you want to see. And the more I examined, the more questions arose, which I still haven't had answers to, except from people who will say, you're completely off the wall, mate, forget it, you know, what are you looking for? You're not going to find it. America landed men on the moon, there were 12 of them landed on there. There were 9 missions to 25 astronauts went to the moon and came back again. You can ask any one of them, they'll tell you they went to the moon. Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course, it's a very upsetting thing if you believe very strongly, of course, that, you know, this great achievement of mankind was what on the surface it appeared to be. When someone like you comes along and suddenly tries to knock that down, inevitably they are going to feel hurt and they're going to react against that initially. Certainly, that's what I've felt when I've had conversations with people about that. The initial kickback is, don't be ridiculous.
Exactly.
But then, when you start to look at the evidence, and that's what you're very good at doing, is leading people to the evidence and leaving them to make up their own minds, that is often when the questions begin that these people can't just dismiss.
That's the point. There's no point in forcing a view on somebody unless they agree with it themselves as a result of what you say. It's the only way that somebody can be convinced. That's why when I first heard this, I reacted against it. I thought, let me say, stupid. You know, of course, NASA's record is correct. Why would they lie? And then I found, of course, that the New York Times had decided that NASA should be called Never a Straight Answer, because that was apparently what they gave every time they were asked a question. And
Indeed.
a lot of people have become a little disenchanted with the continual stonewalling. They're not prepared to look and answer the questions that can be legitimately asked. All right, I could be totally wrong. To be honest, I hope I am totally wrong, because I watched the moon landings live. I'm old enough to have been around when it happened. I lived in London at the time. I even looked out the window at the moon and thought, oh, there are men up there. This is fantastic. All these years later, 43 years later, we're still talking about it. Nothing to do with the space station, nothing to do with the shuttle program, as reported. Just Apollo. That's the key. It's not attacking everything. I'm not attacking it, I'm just questioning.
No, I mean, I suppose you have to some degrees, be forthright to try to get some kind of reaction out of people and therefore get answers. And in fact, I mean, that takes me to something that I've never heard you discuss before, which I'd quite like to ask you about. Now, forthright views. Anybody that's been in any kind of London cab will often hear forthright views from the driver. And I understand that at one point in your history, you were a London minicab driver.
I was.
Tell
London
more.
minicab in the, when was it now? Late 1960s, early 1970s. I was a minicab driver because I was living in London. I like London, it's a great city. And I thought, what a good way to find out about London. Be paid to drive around it. If you're a minicab driver, of course, you don't have to pass the knowledge which black cab drivers have to pass. You find out as you go along. You're paid to find your way around London, which is great fun. And you get all sorts of people in your... At the back of my... I've had MPs and actresses and actors, people throwing up, people giving me more money than I expected. Everything can happen, and you just take it. And after a while, you get to know London. And it's not an easy city to drive around. Anybody who's tried to drive around it will know it's easy to get lost, it's not easy to find your way around. It took me 6 months to really understand the centre part of London. Not the suburbs, not the north, the south, east or the west, but just the central, sort of Kensington through to the city, Hampstead down to Lambeth. Easy to do that. And then suddenly, when you've been driving down various roads, it suddenly all comes together. You can get in your head a map. You know where you're going. If you're in the city and you have to go to Kensington, you know how to get there. You know which roads you're going to go down. You get a confidence about it. There are certain people who find it very difficult to follow directions or to drive, especially in London. It's a frightening city to drive in if you're not prepared for what can happen. But to suddenly find that I could easily navigate across London, and I now say that I never get lost in London.
I mean, that says something, in a way, about what you're doing today, because one of the observations that's been made about you is that you seem to have this ability to hold so much knowledge, seemingly sometimes disconnected, and yet you know how to make the connection. So do you think finding your way around a huge city was in some way helpful to that way of thinking, maybe?
That's an interesting point, which I hadn't really looked at before, but I think you're right. There is a similarity between finding your way around a city, which is a vast amorphous mass when you start and becomes real when you know your way around it, to putting together all from different things like UFOs or crop circles or the moon landings or ancient Egypt or world grids or free energy devices. All these things, they're part of what Nexus deals with anyway. But to put them all together and see the connections, and there are connections between all these various things. I'm not saying there's a direct connection between free energy and crop circles, but there might be.
Although some might say there is, of course.
I know people have said there is. And UFOs. Whether UFOs exist or I've never seen one. I've seen what I think might be considered an unidentified object, but was it a UFO? Yes, it was unidentified, it was flying, and it was an object. It doesn't mean to say it came from out Alpha Centauri. It could have come from down the road. Who knows? And who actually cares? It doesn't actually matter where it's from.
Well, I mean, some might, of course, disagree with that. But another thing that I just briefly should mention, that you're obviously quite good at, therefore, selling ideas to people. And, of course, at one point, I believe you were a car service rep for a company that, shall we name?
I think we should name Toyota.
Toyota. So you obviously, you have the knack of selling tricky things to people, but obviously very well. Yeah. So I understand you worked for Toyota for some years, I understand.
17 years I worked for Toyota. They make very, very good cars. I still drive a Toyota today.
Now we're getting into advertising territory.
Sorry. No,
other brands do exist, we should tell you. Of
thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you made the point. Toyota, I worked for them 17 years. It's not hard to work for a company that produces good products. And I'll say Toyota produce good products. Anybody who drives a Toyota knows they're a good product. It was the world's top company a couple of years ago, until they had a few problems in Japan.
But of course, the people that don't believe that, you have to sell to them. And if you like an idea that they may not be convinced of, which of course has led on to the very thing that you're doing today.
Exactly.
Which is trying to sell very difficult to swallow ideas.
All you have to do...
we're going to stop there briefly. We will come back to this. We're going to take a break. Come back soon. See you very soon.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine. On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Welcome back to On the Edge, and I'm here with our guest Marcus Allen of Nexus magazine. Now, Marcus, we've had a few texts come through, we've got so many, in fact. Sadly, we can't do them all justice, but we'll do a few. One of them here is, do you think that the astronauts knew of the conspiracy, if there was one, or were they brainwashed or hypnotised to forget it? Now, there's an interesting thought.
Okay, a couple of points on this. All the astronauts were military, including Neil Armstrong. Every astronaut was a military person, under orders from their president. That's how American military works. If the president says jump, they have one question: how high, sir? If they are told to do this, they do it.
So you feel they were more likely to have been acting under orders rather than hypnotised?
I don't think they were hypnotised. I don't think you could hypnotise 27 men of that calibre. They were very high calibre people. They were test pilots. They were the best of the best. They had the right stuff, all that.
So acting under orders, yeah. you feel it.
But bear in mind one thing, they did a lot of simulation exercises, a lot of training exercises, which were all photographed and filmed quite openly. There's no secret about it. There's no Area 51 involved in any of this. They can be identified, the places. Virginia was one, Texas was another, Seattle was another. They had setups.
Yes, they had stages already, didn't they? And indeed there are some photographs, I understand, where they're training, and there they are on a sort of fake moon site. Yeah. So it wouldn't be too much to augment that and make something more of it.
No.
Which in a way leads to another question, because we have somebody here asking, did Stanley Kubrick create the moon landing hoax? Now, either this is a theory that many people have put forward over the years, which is that maybe, for those of you that have seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, that they used at least some of the techniques of Stanley Kubrick that he used for that film, but others say, was he directly involved? And Walt Disney, I understand, is another name that's been put forward. How do you feel about that?
It's coincidental in many cases. Certainly Stanley Kubrick was a filmmaker of the very highest order. There is circumstantial evidence which indicates he might have been involved in a consultancy basis, because he was making the film 2001: A Space Odyssey at the same time as NASA were planning the moon landings. He may well have been asked for advice on how to film it. Whether he created it, now there is a point here which is worth looking at. It's called front screen projection. Now that was just coming into the technical aspect of filmmaking in the late 1960s, and Stanley Kubrick, I believe, was one of the very first people to use it. Front screen as opposed to back screen projection meant that much bigger sets could be used, and it was used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. The scenes at the beginning of the movie where Africa and the apes, who were all actors, was all filmed at Pinewood Studios with projected backgrounds. And if you look closely at it, you will see there is a dividing line between the screen, which is just a big white sheet made by the 3M's company, and the foreground action. And you can see that dividing line.
Which, of course, then calls to mind a few of the lunar photographs, supposedly, where, again, you do have a clear dividing line. And I know some critics have said, well, what is that line?
Exactly.
Wouldn't there be some kind of smooth transition? So you feel that may be what's going on?
I would say that it's certainly something which should be investigated further. And it has been. There are people on the internet who've done quite a bit of investigation into this. I'm not persuaded that Kubrick filmed it, because if that was ever discovered, his career was ended. He did a lot more films after that.
Indeed.
But it is interesting, if you look at his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, was released on the 16th of July, 1999, 30 years to the day after the landing of Apollo 11. Coincidence? It's possible.
What? It's
or
possible.
what?
Or what?
Maybe he just had a great sense of humour.
Well, maybe indeed he did. I mean, one thing just also to say is, of course, in 2001 A Space Odyssey, interestingly, the backgrounds to the moons, it's quite jagged rocks, because this was shortly before they'd actually got there, whereas, of course, what we see in the NASA pictures are quite soft.
Quite soft.
But whether that has any meaning, I don't know. Just one more question for now. We will come back to text later on. Keep texting through. You might be lucky. One I rather liked was, in your opinion, what will be the first big conspiracy theory to become conspiracy fact? Any
My immediate thought on that is the Vietnam War.
Okay.
The Gulf of Tonkin. We were told that American naval ships were fired on by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. They had to defend themselves and were attacked again. That was what we were told at the time, hence the rationale for the Vietnam War and the amount of troops that were sent in. We discover years and years later that there were no torpedo boats attacking American naval ships. They were actually trying to get out of the way.
Well, I mean, one thing I understand is that there had been a minor skirmish a day or so before, and then there were sonar errors, and you can get these ghost sort of echoes, can't you? And I believe they did blast away, but it very quickly became clear they were firing at nothing. However, word had gone out that, hey, we're under attack, and curiously enough, President Johnson never heard the bit that said, no, we're not under attack, which I understand did follow quite soon after. So in your view, I mean, in a way, that is already historically on the record, isn't it?
It is historically.
There is an event that didn't occur.
Yeah, and earlier than that, of course, there's Operation Northwards, which is the false flag operation, whereby an American plane was to be shot down by American fighters, and it was to be blamed on Cuba. This was in the early 1960s when Cuba was upsetting America by not paying attention to them. John Kennedy was president at the time, vetoed it. But there was a proposal, it's on record, that this would be a good way of allowing an invasion of Cuba to take place.
Well, I mean, of course, some would say that 9/11 was a kind of a distant relative of that plot. Obviously, they didn't do it in that instance, but it makes you realise there are people out there who might well think in that direction.
This is the point. There are people who are prepared to think like that, and it does take very honourable politicians, of which we seem to have few. Honourable
there may be
politicians.
1 or 2 out there.
There are 1 or 2
We
honourable.
don't know who they are, but there may be 1 or 2.
Please hold your hand up.
Yes.
But there are politicians who are prepared to do the honest job that a politician should do, which is to talk, not shoot.
Well, listen, thank you for the text. We do have more, but keep them coming in, and maybe yours will be read out. So, Marcus, just to come back to the story of Nexus magazine, or at least your involvement with it. Now, we heard earlier on how you sort of became aware of it, but what made you think, goodness me, I want this magazine to be read more widely? What was it that triggered you to actually want to be directly involved?
I first came across Nexus in Glastonbury, as you do. Somebody showed me a copy of it that they got from America, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, nice magazine. I couldn't buy it in the UK. It came from Australia. I wasn't prepared to pay the money to subscribe from Australia. 6 months later, Toyota, who I was working for, had decided they had enough of me, so they gave me a big check and told me to get lost. I was made redundant. This was in the early 90s. I thought, well, what do I do now? Oh, well, maybe I could sell cars or bits of cars. Maybe I could sell a magazine. How hard is that? So I went out to Australia, my wife and I went out for our 25th wedding anniversary, a treat, and we met up with Duncan Rhodes, who's the editor of Nexus, and I said, look, I'd like to sell it in the UK. He said, well, good on you, mate, you know, here's 500 copies, see how you get on. So we land back at Heathrow. Well, how do we sell magazines? I know, phone W.H. Smith. Who's your distributor? I am, I said. No, you're not. That's when I started to discover about magazines and distribution and sales. And basically, I just took a copy. I was into crop circles at the time, and I found a copy of a magazine which had a list of shops that sold crop circle magazines. I thought, I know, they might like Nexus. So I literally drove around those shops and said, would you want to sell Nexus? And they said, we'll give it a go. I went to conferences, 40 Times conference, the first one we went to in 1994, many hundreds since, mainly the Glastonbury Symposium, which I understand you have quite a lot to do with.
Oh, now and then I show up.
You show up very well. And more and more people found out about Nexus, more and more people liked it, more and more people bought it, and I gave it 6 months, and 6 months came and went, and we give it another 6 months, and 18 years later, we're still giving it 6 months.
Well, I think these 6 months have been very well spent, because, I mean, certainly there is a sense that in recent times we've seen quite an upsurge of interest in all the kinds of things that Nexus has been talking about for years, and yet certainly when I sort of came into this world, you know, 20 years ago, there was virtually nothing to read. The internet was still in its infancy, and Nexus was, at that time, really the only place you could seriously get this information. And as such, I mean, it's been an anchor for many people.
It's certainly something which, yes, as you say, the information wasn't generally available. Before the internet, you literally had to buy a magazine. Now, which magazine did you buy? You maybe buy 40 Times, or then Graham Birdsall's UFO magazine, which covered the UFO subject pretty well. But there was not much else. So maybe Nexus was fortuitously timed to be read and appreciated, and a lot of people still do. We still sell many thousands of copies an issue. It's available throughout the country at W.H. Smith and major newsagents and a few specialist shops, and obviously on subscription from the office. Give us a call, nexusmagazine.com. You can easily get
Other brands do exist.
Thank you, Andy.
I should say, we will come back to a little bit about what it's really like to work for Nexus, because I sort of want to get under the skin of that. But, you know, just to keep the subject sort of spread out here, one of the things that impresses me about what you're saying there is how hands-on you were when you were out there trying to get these magazines. You were literally driving from shop to shop. And I see in your work, especially with the moon landings, that again, you're very hands-on. It's like you want to know what the cameras are like, for instance. And you actually will go and you will find one of the cameras that they used on the moon missions, because you have then got a very three-dimensional reality. I think we have an image somewhere, don't we?
114 will cover it.
If we can call up 114, image 114. Here we go. Here we can see the actual camera that was used, or one of the cameras. This
was lent to us by Hasselblad UK. It's a Hasselblad camera. It's the best camera you could buy then in the 1960s. Still the best camera you can buy today. Top left picture is a side-on view of the Lunar replica camera. The magazine is at the left-hand side, and you'll notice 3 black dials. One just says 200 on it, which is the number of images in the magazine, and below that is the film counter. It is the only indication that the film has actually moved forward. The lens is on the right-hand side, and below it is the motor drive, because the only automatic feature of that camera was the film advance. It was basically a point-and-shoot camera.
Now, some would say, of course, well, that sounds perfectly reasonable. They obviously took a good camera to the moon. What's the problem?
There's no viewfinder. The viewfinder on Hasselblad camera is normally on the top of the camera, and you look down into it. It's a 70mm, or as it was called then, 2¼ square. That's the size of the negative. And you would look down into the viewfinder, which would allow you to look through the lens with a mirror, which when you took a picture, you pressed the shutter, which is on the front of the camera. The shutter would flick up, and the image would be exposed onto the film. On the Lunar camera, on this Lunar camera, there was no viewfinder.
Your contention being?
That it's very difficult to take some of the pictures that we are told were taken with this camera using a camera that has no viewfinder. Now, it was strapped to the front of the astronaut's chest. Now, if we look at, we've got an image of the camera. No, we don't. Okay.
Well, the camera we have,
Yeah,
on the chest. No, I don't think we have a shot.
It was normally attached to the astronaut's chest.
Yeah.
There was a special panel that
Yeah,
was
well, you
there.
see them, don't you, sort of protruding from about this level.
He could use his hands and he didn't have to worry about the camera. So it meant the camera was in one position, on chest level. The shutter, to fire the shutter, to take a picture, was on the front of the camera, which you could not see from inside the spacesuit. You could not hear it, because you're in space. In space, no one can hear you scream. And you couldn't see if the film had actually wound on. You couldn't hear it either. And there was no mirror, so you couldn't hear that. So how do you know you're taking a picture?
So we have two issues here. Number one, could it be that they, were risking coming back with blank film because they never actually took anything on it? Or number two, of course, which is that actually they were not very good because they couldn't even see what they were looking for. Okay. And indeed, one of the texts that we had, that we didn't read out, was asking, well, could it be that, we did go to the moon, everything was as we saw, but of course, maybe there was something wrong. The radiation fogged the film. They just couldn't get good shots. They weren't prepared. So that's why they had to replace the image record in a studio. Now, how do you feel about that? Because I know there are people, of course, who do not believe that we went to the moon at all. And I don't know the answer to this. But, what's your feeling? What's your gut feeling about that?
The question is, did the named astronauts go to the moon?
What, you mean so it's possible somebody went up there and did take some basic shots, which, they used as backgrounds, or...?
Well, let's look at picture 111, which is a picture taken on the moon by Neil Armstrong of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder from the lunar module, the Eagle. And you'll notice on the left-hand side of the picture, that is the exact size of the image that was taken by Neil Armstrong. And you notice several things about it. One is that it is beautifully centered, it's well composed. It's also very accurately exposed. And it's also in shadow.
Yes,
the astronaut
with the
is
sun
in shadow.
Sort of behind it. So where does all this light come from?
Where does all the light come from?
Because I, as far as I understand it, NASA say that it bounced up from the lunar surface, but that falls down, doesn't it? Because you have these huge pools of black shadow often in the foreground, and you think, well, where is all that light reflected from?
Okay. The other point is that the film used was Kodak Ektachrome. Kodak Ektachrome has very specific qualities of light absorption. It will take very, very good photographs if it is exposed accurately. Now you'll notice on that previous picture we just looked at that the directly illuminated surface of the moon was exposed accurately. So was the shadow area, and yet the two are so far apart in light intensity.
How did they manage to expose?
How did the film record that without, and there was no fill-in flash taken, there was no reflectors taken except the surface?
Well, in the second part and the online part of this programme, we'll be looking at this in a lot more detail. But we're going to go to a break. We shall be with you after these messages. See you soon.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine. On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Hello and welcome back to On the Edge, where I am speaking to Marcus Allen. And Marcus, we have been talking about the moon landings, but we will come back to some of the detail of that in the second part of the show. But there was just one more area that I briefly wanted to touch on with you here, which was the question of the other evidence, because of course, people question the photographs, but others say, well, but you don't need those because we have the astronauts. We've talked about would they have lied, would they have not. But of course, the other one people always come in with is, well, we have moon rock. So clearly the moon rock proves we stood on the moon.
Yeah, obviously.
So how do you feel about that?
Well, if you go to the Science Museum in London, you can see a piece of moon rock. And you know it's a piece of moon rock. It's in a very nice box with a label, moon rock. So we know it's moon rock, don't we? Because we believe the Science Museum. But would we have believed? Would we have believed the Rijksmuseum? If we look at picture number 113, this is a piece of moon rock, we're told, that was given to the Dutch Prime Minister following a visit by the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts. When the Dutch Prime Minister of the day retired, it was presented to the Rijksmuseum, which is the Dutch equivalent of the British Museum, a magnificent museum in Amsterdam, and it was put on display for 30 years. When the Rijksmuseum was undergoing big renovation fairly recently, it was taken off display and it was examined by obviously people who fully understood what they were looking at, and they discovered it wasn't rock, it was a piece of petrified wood.
Ah.
Which raised some interesting questions. Why haven't we been told there are trees on the moon? Why didn't they know it was petrified wood? And if it was presented by the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts, is it reasonable to assume that they got it from the moon? And if they didn't, why didn't they say so? NASA have yet to answer these questions. They have been asked, but they haven't yet answered. So we don't know if when we're told we're looking at moon rock, we're actually looking at moon rock or a piece of petrified wood.
And I do believe, I think it was Andrew Steele, who was an astrobiologist, when he finally was granted a tiny bit of lunar soil to examine, when he looked at it, it turned out to have all sorts of earthly contamination in it. Yeah. And it clearly was soil from the Earth, but this had been given by NASA as moon soil. So there's clearly something not quite right there. It's not quite right.
I should say that there is material on Earth which came from the moon. The Russians in the early 1970s did manage to acquire a few hundred grams of lunar material. So it's
using automated probes.
Using automated probes, using automated craft, but not rocks. So the question is still open.
The question is still open. One text, because we should just get a few of these in here, is asking, is there any kind of telltale information in the reflections that you see in the astronauts' helmets? You know, can you see lights or rigs? What can you see there?
Oh, you can see all sorts of wonderful things if you look at it. There are several on Apollo 12. There are some very good close-ups of the Apollo 11, Al Bean, I think it is, specifically his visor reflects the other astronaut, only 2 on the moon at any one time, reflects the astronaut. And looking at it in detail, it's very hard to see that the astronaut who's supposed to be taking the picture has actually got his hand anywhere near the camera button, the camera shutter button. Aside from that, there are lights, I swear that if you show them to anybody and you say, well, what's that line across there? Oh, that's lights. Well, they didn't have lights on the moon. There are other anomalies. This is the word, there are so many anomalies about these. Yes. It's almost as if somebody was involved in the whole Apollo photographic project, which is a big project, 32,000 images taken on the lunar surface, and you can see every single one of them on the internet now. Somebody was concerned that the public were being misled and decided to try to draw attention to some real anomalies, so that maybe in the future researchers would pick up on this and question the Apollo record. And that's what I'm doing, questioning the Apollo record.
And another text just asks, is there any absolute evidence that NASA has ever faked an image? And in fact, I think we can give an example of this. Can we just go to image 108? If we can go to image 108, I think this might answer that question. Here we are. Now, who are we seeing here?
This is Michael Collins. It's from his autobiography, Carrying the Fire, where he is showing when he was testing the maneuvering jets they had. This is on the Gemini program, the 2-man craft prior to Apollo. He's testing the compressed air maneuvering jets. That's what
so he's in space. So this is the famed spacewalk, of course.
He was spacewalking, and he was trying to see if it was a test to see if the jets would work and do what they wanted them to do. And this was taken from his book, where he's obviously in space.
And I believe has been reproduced elsewhere as A Man in Space.
It's been reproduced in many places, until we look at...
Well, let's go to image 109, because a few years later, I understand somebody found this photograph in the NASA image record of...
Yes. This is the same man, Michael Collins. The 2 images, if laid one on top of the other, are point-to-point exact. It's the same image. One has been blacked out, and you'll notice that there are padded surfaces under his feet. This is known colloquially in NASA as the vomit comet, which is where they practiced weightless manoeuvring.
So this is where the aeroplane sort of like dives down, and then you get the illusion, if you like.
And you can have 30 seconds of weightlessness.
Right. So here is an image very clearly that they have literally cut the man out, stuck him on a black background, and say, hey, look, he's in space.
He's in space.
Glory be.
Yes.
So I think that does answer the question that, yes, there clearly are some images that NASA have directly faked.
Yeah.
And I believe there's one of astronauts playing golf on the moon,
Oh, yeah,
which you can prove is a composite. But listen, we've got other things we need to get to before the end, but we will be coming back to a little bit more technical investigation in the online second part of the show, if you get to see that. So do subscribe, give Edge all your support. But talking of rocks, of course, you're interested in some other kinds of rocks as well, ancient rocks. And one of the other strings to your bow is, of course, the investigation of ancient technology. What made the pyramids? How did these ancient structures get here? I think we've got an image. If we go to image 110, we can see a fine example of something that not a lot of people have heard about. What are we seeing here, Marcus?
This looks like a rather junior version of Stonehenge. I think most people would agree there are certain similarities, upright monoliths, horizontal blocks between them. This is actually in Libya, to the east of Tripoli. It was published, I first became aware of it when it was published in Robert Temple's book, Egyptian Dawn, where he was talking a great deal about Egypt, but these were some of the images he showed. This image itself comes from a book published in 1897, which was the first geological research done in Libya at the time. There are many other images which show blocks of similar and larger, in some cases larger size. I just say whether they're still there now or not, I don't know. That image itself...
It's remarkable in itself that there is this sort of mini Stonehenge that most people have never heard of.
Never heard of it.
And if indeed it is still there, we still don't hear very much about it.
If it's still there, if anybody is listening in Libya or is going to Libya or is aware of the site in Libya, please photograph it. I'm sure it's now much easier to do it in Libya and any other sites like that, any other ancient rocks, any ancient sites, any ancient monoliths, please, we'd like to see them.
And of course the other big puzzle, which is an eternal one, but I know that it's one that's drawn you over the years, is how literally did they put these things together? How did they cut the blocks and put them up? And we will come to more of this in the second part of the programme, but just as one example, can you give us one good example of something unexplained about the ancient technology?
Okay, picture 115 shows a very familiar object, the unfinished obelisk at Aswan. Unfinished because it's still in the bedrock. What you see there is a block of granite. This is granite material. A block of granite. It's 42 meters long, and there is a trench you can see around that obelisk. And that trench is about 2.5, 3 meters deep. So it stretches all around it, so you can easily calculate it's nearly 100 meters long. 2 meters deep, and you say, well, how did they cut it? Because it's been cut. Now, if we look at picture number 116, we're looking at the top end of the obelisk, the pointy end, and you'll notice the trench all around it. But look at that point. There are certain features about it, and in the trench, they appear to be scoop marks. And you ask anybody, any Egyptologist, you say, well, how was the unfinished obelisk cut as far as it was? It's cut 2-3 meters deep. It was pounded with diorite balls, diorite being a form of granite, harder than this material. Pound the granite with the diorite ball. What nonsense is that? You can do the calculation very easily, and it's been done. You get a piece of granite, and you're going to cut a square foot of granite to the depth of 1 inch, pounding it with a ball. How long would it take to remove that 1 inch depth of 1 square foot of granite? And the answer is 5 hours.
Right.
So you then calculate how long it would take to cut that trench around the obelisk. And the answer is 35 years.
Well, of course, some would argue, well, maybe it took 35 years. But I think, and we're short on time, but just to round this, I think the point you're making is there are so many unanswered questions.
Yes.
And I suppose, in a way, that's what you're about, isn't it? And what Nexus magazine's about is trying to identify for people these glaring anomalies, both in the modern record and the ancient record, and saying, we need to discuss this.
We need to look at other explanations. The Egyptologists have done great work on their archaeology and discovering things, but they are completely useless as far as explanations beyond their competence is concerned. I'm not claiming to be competent, but I look at something and I say, how is that done? I look at that unfinished obelisk and I say, could there have been another explanation? Could it have been something which is known about in South America called the rock softening liquid, which can be spread onto a piece of granite, It's been done in South America. Andesite is the same as granite in South America. And it softens it to the point where it can be scooped away. And the historical record that exists in Peru, that is known about. So if anybody is going to Peru, here is your mission.
Have a look.
Find some rock softening liquid. It is still available, I believe.
No, of course. I mean, you will have others who will say, and I can't say if they're right or wrong, you know, no, you're totally wrong. These were made by extraterrestrials, or they were made by some, you know, powerful race that have gone away. Now, I mean, at Nexus magazine, you must, I would imagine, have phone calls and emails about everything under the sun. And, I mean, do you have a stance? So, like, if somebody rings you up and says, well, you know, what's your stance on the New World Order? Does Nexus have... Does it have a generic stance, or what would you say to that?
Nexus would not have an opinion beyond the information that we supply to allow people to make sense of the world around them. That's basically the mission statement of Nexus, to provide information to allow people to make sense of the rapid changes that are going on around them. Whether it is the New World Order, whoever they are, can you name anybody in the New World Order? You could say
I'm sure some would say they could, but maybe we'll come to that in the second part.
Okay, there are interesting points to make about that. Whether the monuments in Egypt were made by extraterrestrials, interesting. I couldn't see any evidence for it, but there is more evidence now becoming uncovered. There are some very interesting programs being made. Now, they go out on the satellite channels all around the world. People are looking at this information. They're not satisfied with the pat explanations of the current academics, who appear to be so totally out of touch that they're becoming a laughingstock.
Yes.
I mean, we sell a book through Nexus called Forbidden Archaeology. Forbidden as in hidden. It's 1,000 pages long. It's put together by somebody who spent 8 years researching the records of archaeological discoveries that just disappeared. More and more people are trying to locate the original inhabitants of this planet, because the evidence goes back hundreds of millions of years. And that is the exciting part. What we're being told is such a comic book version of our history, that our real history is so dramatic and so interesting, that please, can we start looking and finding out about it?
But of course, you know, one of the things that I've heard said, and it's been said about you and me and just about everybody, is if you don't support the most extremist views, that, you know, whatever conspiracy was done by whoever, the Illuminati or the Zionists or whatever it may be, that you are working for the other side because you don't agree with that. What's the stance on that? Because you must be hit with that a few times. People
do love to pigeonhole. And if they can pigeonhole Nexus or me or you or anybody else who happens to look for these things into a little box that says, don't pay attention, they're nuts. It's easy for them. Their world now goes on, rolling forward. They don't have to worry about the hard questions. Okay, leave us to our job. Leave us to find out the information that can help, because people really do like this. The number of people who phone Nexus and say, I love Nexus, it's really changed my life. People actually do say that. From a health point of view, we publish health articles as well as archaeological stuff, as well as history. We publish future science, free energy, anti-gravity. There's so much information that once people's lives are directed in a way that they can follow and understand, it changes them.
Well, Marcus, I think that you do a very good job, and I hope that you will keep it up.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine. On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Hello, and if you're joining us for this online Over the Edge, welcome back, and thank you for coming to find out more. Let's talk about this, because conspiracy theory, it's become a word that's used as a term of abuse.
Yeah.
Now, I've always maintained that we should do what the Quakers did, because the term Quaker was actually an attack. They were accused of quaking in the sight of God, and it was an insult to call them that. Yeah. And they thought, well, that's not a bad term. Well, let's just call ourselves the Quakers. And, of course, that neutralised the intended insult. But, of course, what's happened with conspiracy theory is, because so many people in the mainstream say, oh, well, that's just conspiracy theory, it's become an insult. And yet, if you look at the technical definition of what a conspiracy theory is, it's a very reasonable thing to be theorising about. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I say, what about the word theory don't you understand? It is not an established fact, it's a theory. Like the theory of relativity or any other theory you can come up with. It's not a proven fact, it's something which you are investigating. A conspiracy is an act committed by two or more people which is hidden and illegal. I mean, goodness sake, you've only got to watch the Levinson inquiry to see a few conspiracies going on. There's nothing theoretical about them.
Well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? As soon as a theory or a conspiracy theory goes public, isn't it interesting how suddenly it's not a conspiracy?
Oh, no, it's not a conspiracy.
It becomes a scandal or some other word. Yeah. So even though it is very definitely a conspiracy theory, it suddenly isn't. I always find that curious.
A conspiracy theory is something put forward to try to explain an event or something occurring which, though it may have an explanation, let's take 9/11 as an example, that has an official explanation. We all know what the official explanation is. Or should I say the official conspiracy theory?
Indeed.
The official explanation is that four planes got hijacked and were flown into buildings or hit the ground. And people got killed. And it was done by people who didn't like America. Therefore, we have to go and attack those people who didn't like America and make them like America by bombing them. That's the best way to go about it. It sounds a bit crazy to me. And now there are a lot of people who will go around saying, okay, excuse me, those facts don't actually explain the events that we have seen on our televisions. What about this? What about that? What about this? Do buildings collapse when hit by aeroplanes? Never been known before or since. Is that a conspiracy theory, or is that just a reasonable question to ask? It's a reasonable question to ask. Let's try to understand how it can happen. Go back nearly 50 years. John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. He gets hit in the head by a bullet, or two, or possibly three. It doesn't matter, he's dead. Who did it? Nobody actually has ever found out whether it was a conspiracy, i.e. more than one person involved. It appears it was. Or was it just one person, the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone gunman who killed John Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, 5 years later, or Martin Luther King? These are all the official explanation to divert attention is that it is a lone gunman acting on his own, doing it for ridiculous reasons. Unless there's more than one person involved, in which case it's a conspiracy. Now, if there's more than one person involved, you have to prove it. Until then, it's a conspiracy theory. A theory is an unproven fact.
But there's nothing disgraceful about that, is there?
Absolutely.
I mean, science is based largely on theory to begin with, and then, of course, they try to prove the theory. So it's funny how the word theory, when it comes to conspiracy, is considered such a terrible thing, but that's not true outside of conspiracy. I mean, what I think, that raises a very good point, because I think the other thing that we have is, because if you are labelled as a conspiracy theorist, you are simply not given the gravity that a more mainstream questioner of exactly the same things would get. I mean, we have a good example of that in our dim and distant past, where a few years ago we were on BBC One's The One Show, and Princess Diana's inquest, the inquest into Princess Diana's death, had basically said there is no conspiracy, you know, it was a drunken driver, that's all there is to it. And they were trying to find out from some good people like us, why do people still believe in conspiracy theories? And we were interviewed by Kelvin Mackenzie, weren't we? Perfectly nice to us, very reasonable conversation. And we filmed in a very nice hotel for about 3 hours all afternoon. Now, listen, we understand, of course, that it's going to be cut. There are edits you need to make. So we knew, you know, there'd be, was it maybe 2 or 3 minutes? What did we get? I think we got 28 seconds.
Something like that.
Where I think somebody said their name, one of us nodded, and I said Guy Fawkes. That was it. I mean, that was all we were given. But they were quite happy to cut back to the studio for a 5-minute discussion saying that, you know, how unlikely it was that the likes of us were correct. And yet we'd never even been given a chance to actually talk about the evidence that is important. So, you know, this happens again and again. This must have happened to you, I'm sure, many times.
Frequently, where you're talking about something, you're putting forward particular views, particular explanations for why something happens to be this way. The moon landings specifically are the ones I get normally attacked for, which is fair enough. You know, people should make sure that my evidence, if I'm putting forward an opposing view to the official view, that what I say can stack up. And hopefully it can stack up. That's why I emphasize the fact that I understand about cameras, I understand about photographs and films. So that when I look at a photograph, and this is the point that I've asked several professional photographers, I've shown them a picture from the moon. I said, can you explain how this photograph was taken, given that the camera had no viewfinder? He said, simple. You just take lots and lots of pictures and you'll get lucky. Yeah, that's correct. That is a totally correct answer. I say, well, given that you're in an unknown environment where you don't know the precise level of sunlight that you're operating under, the film you're using is particularly sensitive to exposure. Wouldn't it be best to bracket that film, bracket that image? Bracket means take the same picture with different exposures, half a stop higher, half a stop lower, and so on. And hopefully you'll get lucky and you'll get one right. That's what normal professional photographers will do.
But I understand they didn't do that.
There's no evidence whatsoever, and I've examined thousands of the lunar photographs. They're very easy to examine. You can go to click them forward on the web. There's not one example of bracketing. And virtually every photograph is correctly composed, correctly exposed, it's not out of focus, which you can't see. Normally you'd have to focus and you look through the
I mean,
viewfinder.
we're talking 1960s technology here. You know, we're not talking with all the automatic meters we have today.
Yeah.
So this is obviously very important.
Yeah. Now, if you're going to say, okay, well, if that is the case, what's your explanation? Because these are good photographs. Absolutely. They are brilliant photographs. They are professional, high-quality PR images, beautifully composed. NASA used them to promote their space program to the American people who were paying for it through their taxes. Fine, I don't have a problem with that. Where did they take the photographs? Was it on the moon? That's what NASA will tell you. Yes, they were taken on the moon. I say, no, they were not taken on the moon for this reason. The images are too good using the camera we know that they were using. There's no dispute about the camera. There's no explanation for how the film that was not damaged by radiation, which we know is extreme in space, especially on the moon. The temperature is not so much of an issue because they're in a vacuum and the temperature wouldn't necessarily apply in the same way as it does on Earth when it travels through, it's convected through the air. So it's not the same, the temperature isn't the same. The point is, the temperature is very extreme. It goes from one extreme to the other. There's no gradual increase in temperature or decrease in temperature. On the moon, you go into the sunlight, you're in 100 degrees centigrade, you go into the shadow, you're in minus 100 degrees. Bigger than any temperature difference here on Earth.
Because if you took a piece of 1960s film down here and put it in a cooker and then in a fridge, it probably, coming out of the fridge and the cooker, wouldn't be in too good a state,
not
really,
too
would
good.
it?
But
And yet that's really what we're looking at.
Yeah, but the point is that we showed at the beginning the image of the camera and how it was used and the electric motor. And I didn't point them out, but in one of those images there was the picture of the motor itself, image number 101. Oh, sorry, wrong one.
114?
114.
Yeah, let me just go back to 114.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at the camera. Here we are.
Top right image is the camera lying on its side, and the two circles below it are the batteries that were powering the motor advancing the film. Now those, when you take them out, they're actually normal D-type batteries. They're made by Varta in Germany. Nothing wrong with that. But you have your car sat in the cold for a few hours or overnight and the battery is a bit on the dicky side, you're not going to start your car in a hurry because the batteries do not hold charge in extreme cold. On the moon, they were in the shade. The temperature was minus 100 degrees centigrade. Those batteries would not have operated.
That's a very good question. Now, of course, there is another argument that says that, okay, maybe the still images, they had to fake some of those. But we have videos. Now, we know that we stood on the moon because the videos show people, they're clearly in zero gravity, they're bouncing along nicely. Surely the videos are real. How would you respond
I'm
to
glad
that?
you said bouncing along, because that is the key. Here on Earth, if you want to transmit video from a moving vehicle, how do you do it? You transmit to a receiver, usually close by. Formula One do it all the time. They transmit live images from a car doing 200 miles an hour into your television. And it's done because there is a camera and a transmitter on board, and this is 2010 technology. In 1969, we are asked to believe that a buggy bouncing around on the lunar surface, 250,000 miles, 238,000 miles, before anybody questions it, 238,000 miles away, with a dish antenna about 30 centimetres in diameter.
I think we can see that, but can we run the video while we chat of the lunar buggy?
Yeah,
I believe this is Apollo 17, I believe, and you'll see it bouncing along. Here we go. So here we see the lunar rover, as it's called.
And notice the little circular item on the top at the front pointing up. That's pointing towards Earth. Not. Because it can't point towards Earth at all the time. It's bouncing around, it's going in different directions. That is what we are told transmitted the images from the buggy. There was a television camera on the buggy as well that transmitted images to Earth. Okay, what bandwidth would that take? Any technical person could tell us what bandwidth would be required and what power would be required to drive that bandwidth and what size of receiver here on Earth would be needed to pick up a tiny little bit of signal coming from the moon. I don't think that happens.
Very good question. In fact, we have a text about the buggies, and do keep your text coming in, by the way. There's still time if you want to text in. And somebody's saying, actually, how did they even load all those buggies into the rockets? Now, were the buggies really going up into space, or is that in itself, you know, just some other strange, shadowy area that we're not going to get to the bottom of?
It's a very interesting question, because it's only recently that the research has been done to try to answer that. The buggies themselves folded up, believe it or not. We saw the buggy there. When it was loaded onto the rocket, the wheels were folded underneath it, so it was actually compressed into quite a small space, about 4 or 5 foot high, 1.5 meters high. It fitted onto one side of the lower section of the lunar lander, so it could be brought down. Interestingly, there is no film, photograph, or video of the buggy being unloaded from the lander.
Yes, it's just suddenly there, isn't it?
It's suddenly there.
And nobody really knows how this is going. I mean, there's a few things we should say here about this.
Actually, just to complete that, one point on that point about how did they get them to the moon. It was 46 tons was the weight of the lunar lander, lunar rover, and the command module that went to the moon, because it had fuel on board as well to slow it down and bring it off again. Yeah. 46 tons. To put 46 tons into lunar orbit, you have to launch from Earth a rocket containing not only the 46 tons of stuff going to the moon, you've got the stuff that is going to orbit the Earth as well. So in order to get off the Earth, you have to launch a rocket which will achieve a certain velocity. It was in 3 sections. The big section at the bottom had most of the fuel on board, and that weighed about 3,000 tons. The whole rocket, 3,000 tons. Question I quite often get asked is, why didn't the Russians blow the whistle if what you're saying is correct? There's another answer to that, which takes a little time to go into, but the point is that the research into could the rocket have launched that weight of the required weight.
Because some say even like the exhaust that you see coming out of the Saturn V rockets, and nobody denies that they took off.
Oh,
we know they took off, but some say it would not have been powerful enough to have lifted that weight. Is that true?
Yes, that's what they're saying, and it's Russian scientists who've done the research into it. And they're saying that the rocket, you can calculate the speed the rocket is travelling at the point it separates. Stage 1 separates from stage 2. The big bit drops away, the second bit fires and carries on into Earth orbit. You can calculate the speed it's moving at. You also know the speed at which it would have to move at to get that weight of satellite into Earth orbit sufficient to get into moon orbit. And it's not moving fast enough. So they're saying that the Saturn V rocket appears to be fake insofar as it is built, it is showing itself to be much larger than it actually was.
I can feel the hackles rising in the scientific community as we speak.
Okay.
But these are very reasonable questions. And I mean, as I think you've said, if there is an answer, a reasonable answer, please share it. And your contention is that they have not shared the answers. This is what you feel, yes.
It's interesting that Russian physicists, I mean, these are qualified Russian physicists who are prepared to look at this information. They now have access to the same information we do in the West. They didn't have it before. They do now. They've looked at it and said, we just don't get it. We don't see how that rocket could launch. Now, there's another point about the Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V rocket, we're told, could launch 7.5 million pounds into space. Why wasn't it used for the space shuttle, which only required 6.5 million pounds of thrust to get it into space?
Well, indeed, and there are some other questions about the thrust, which we'll come back to in the next part, because there are some very interesting things about when you can and can't see rocket exhaust in space. And we'll come to that, and also we'll follow up some other things. We will be back with you very shortly. Please don't go away. See you soon.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine. On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Hello and welcome back to On the Edge with me, Andy Thomas, and Marcus Allen. Now, Marcus, we've been discussing here lots of things about the NASA images, but one of the interesting areas that we sort of touched on briefly is, okay, so maybe the photos aren't real, but what about the videos? Because you can see that they're in low gravity, that they are bouncing, as we say, and it's obviously low gravity, or is it? Now, how would you
Big water tanks.
Water? No.
Big water tank.
I think you're at odds with most people who would say they were on wires.
Okay, when they... but why were they on wires? When the astronauts were practicing in their spacesuits for walking on the moon, they did it in the only low-gravity environment they could find, which is a big water tank. You get in a big water tank, you can be weighted so that you've got no weight, so they could adjust it to 6 gravity. Now, if you're in water, the resistance of the water slows you down. Therefore, they were practicing, and they were doing it slowly. When they're on the moon, would you move slowly? Now, if you see film of astronauts on the space station moving about, they're not moving slowly. They're moving quite fast. They move quite sort of short, sharp, jerky movements, because it's low gravity is a very difficult environment to work in. You certainly don't move slowly. Whether in order to do it on a big set, as if you're in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, which is Apollo 17, or the Hadley Rill, which is Apollo 15, these are big set, big environments. The hills are 4 or 5 miles away. You can't do it in a big water tank because you haven't got one big enough. And anyway, the water would show up, the bubbles would come up, and no, forget it.
Indeed.
So they'd do it on wires, Peter Pan wires. This is a standard way of reducing weight on anybody. That's why they're called Peter Pan wires, so Peter Pan can fly.
Which I realise some people always go, well, that's ridiculous, because if they were on wires, we'd sometimes see the wires. But of course, there are images where you see flashes above them. And there are some sequences, and we can see one now, in fact, where the astronauts seem to, even if you allow for the low gravity, they seem to dangle and defy the laws of physics, as if something's taking the weight off them. We can see here, this is Apollo 16. Now, watch this sequence, and you will see the astronaut in a minute lean forward at a very strange angle, and seemingly gravity, the laws of gravity are removed. Now, watch now. Now, Marcus, what are we seeing here?
Well, he's fallen over, and he's going to get up.
And it's almost like there is no gravity, and there are moments where he's almost just doing a little handstand. You watch here, there his feet go, he's almost, it's as if there is no gravity, let alone low gravity. And there's lots of sequences like this where it does literally look, doesn't it, as if they're on wires.
It's because his feet weren't really getting much purchase on the ground. Right, he's pushing up with his arms as well. But given what he's wearing, that is actually quite a difficult manoeuvre to do. Underneath that white coverall thing, which is just a piece of material, underneath that is a solid carbon fibre body armour. It's got movable joints in the elbow and the knee and at the waist, but basically it is partly to contain the pressure that had to be in that astronaut spacesuit. He had to operate at £5 per square inch. Anybody can do the maths. How much pressure is on the suit he has to wear? Now, if it was, you would see it bulging out like a Michelin man if he didn't have this body armour to contain the pressure, which is what stops him boiling and dying. So if he's on the moon, he has to have the body armour. They're very difficult to move in. Again, you can't wear half a spacesuit. You've got to wear the gauntlets and the gloves and the helmet as well. And the gauntlets are like heavy-duty gardening gloves. Not easy to
So, I mean, what we're seeing here, therefore, you're saying is very hard to explain because there should actually be so much weight that even in lunar gravity, this sort of like almost dangling there with no weight, even that's going to be quite hard to explain.
If it was in lunar gravity, that suit would have weighed about 30 pounds. On Earth, it weighs 180 pounds. The astronauts themselves weigh about the same, 180 pounds, which is, what, 13, 14 stone. Their guys are about 6 foot high. They're fairly fit. But on the moon, their whole weight would be the equivalent of about 4 or 5 stone, 60 pounds, something like that, at 1/6 gravity. 1/6 gravity doesn't stop the muscles that you have from operating at the same power that they would on Earth. So what we're seeing there is a bit of a weird picture, because you'd expect him, if he's going to push himself up from the ground, he's not pushing his whole weight. He's not pushing 180 pounds of suit and 180 pounds of himself. He's only putting 60 pounds up. But it didn't look a natural movement. And as you say, there are images which you can find which appear to indicate wires.
Yes, you see a little flash above
the
the
flash
heads,
above the
aren't
head.
they? And I mean, of course, one of the other things that's been said is, well, if you speed the film up very slightly, actually, it just looks like they're in a perfectly normal gravity environment, maybe on wires, but even on the other shots where there may be no wires, it's almost as if somebody slowed it down. Now, you were once again on The One Show. Now, The One Show slightly redeemed themselves a couple of years ago when, in the anniversary of the moon landings year, they went to the trouble of seeing, could you fake images of astronauts on the moon bouncing around? And they did use wires, didn't they, and slowed down film, and actually it looked pretty identical to what we see in the
They were quite shocked. It was done in a big studio down in Cardiff.
Because they were obviously trying to debunk you, but it didn't work.
No, it didn't work.
It didn't work like that.
No, they got some poor guy from the production team inside a spacesuit, which they must have borrowed from somewhere, wired him up to a big harness on a pulley system in the roof. It was a studio hired specifically because it had the harness and the rails. They had somebody pulling him along, and he was supposed to try to emulate the astronauts' movement. It took him a little bit of practice to get it right. And blow me down, when they showed the film without all the scenery and just the guy in the suit, it looked exactly like the moon stuff.
Yes,
exactly like it. And then when they speeded it up to double speed, it looked like he was on Earth, just walking around normal way. Because you can look at the film images taken on the moon, and you can see that if you, I mean, one way of speeding up a film is to shoot it at double speed and transmit it at normal speed, which indicates that there are missing frames. And if you look at the film, it has got missing frames. The film is very suspect. Now, the astronauts were allegedly filmed on 16mm cameras, videoed on black and white cameras, and photographed using colour and black and white still photographs. And one of the other problems is that a scene that was photographed and filmed at the same time doesn't match.
Yes, well, there's the famous moment where I think it's John Young has sort of gone up and saluted the flag. He's leapt up, and except for all the positionings are different. The image from the back, which I believe is a video, and the image from the front clearly show differences. It's a restaged moment. And I think that's the problem, isn't it? Is that when they say it's one thing, when it clearly is another, and you can then prove that, you are going to get conspiracy theories.
Yes, you are. Okay.
I mean, the low gravity thing, you know, is a case in point. If we can just briefly go back to the film of the lunar rover on the surface, because some have said this is a piece of film which has in itself been slowed down, because the astronauts themselves, if I understand this correctly, said the dust went everywhere, took ages to come down to the ground in the low gravity. But in this image you see the dust and the dirt skidding off the wheel and splattering down almost instantly.
It's going a sort of rooster tail behind the wheel, which is what you get here on Earth. You get a car going through, you know, with an unprotected wheel, which that one is.
And it actually looks, doesn't it, as if it is just been slowed down.
Yeah, just like it's slowed down.
There is something about this film that's not quite right. And in fact, you brought along a still image that I'd just like to look at, just to make another point. If we could go to the image 112. Now, what are we seeing here?
You'll love this.
What are we seeing here?
This is a picture, a close-up picture of one of the rear wheels of the Apollo 17 rover. It's Apollo 17. Yeah, because it's got the repaired mudguard. They're very proud of repairing their mudguard with a piece of material from the lunar lander, bit of tape. Anyway, where are the wheel tracks? Front of that wheel, back of the wheel. Where's the wheel track? How did it get where it is? You can see the footprint.
Yes, I was going to say, because usually the slightest touch seems to leave quite a clear imprint, doesn't it? And it had moved before this was taken. It wasn't just that they'd only just loaded it onto the ground. I understand that in the image record you can see it had already been used.
It had been.
So yes,
it had been moved. That's why it had that repaired bumper. And if you look closely at the high resolution image of that on the NASA website, you can actually see dirt inside the wheel itself, which indicates it's already.
So it is almost literal, isn't it? As if it's been lowered down and placed there to make a nice scene, but that it was never, in that particular shot, used. Obviously, in the video, we see it moving, but, you know, that could have been staged at a totally different time.
If I say that that was lowered into position by a crane on a set in, let's say, Virginia, near the CIA headquarters, Langley, which is where they had a big set with a huge, great gantry to simulate 1/6 gravity. If I say that, people will say, "How dare you say that? You're causing terrible problems. You're libeling the astronauts. You're saying they didn't do what they said they did." I say, prove they did it. Can you prove they did it? Well, beyond any shadow of a doubt.
Now, we've had a text. There's still time to text, by the way. Just simply text EDGE followed by space and then your message to 86686. Still time to text. Let's look at them, because one of them here is saying, why? Why would they fake that? What would they have to gain? Were they just covering up something they wanted to try to do but couldn't? Or was it for some other reason? Why would they do this?
Right, quick history lesson. Go back to the 1960s. Russia had demonstrated, beyond any shadow of a doubt, it was way ahead in a technical point of view than the Americans in space travel. This is the Cold War, don't forget. The Russians were launching intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's what they were. The Americans had to do the same thing. This is the Cold War. Nothing to do with space. This is the Cold War. The Russians put a little bleeping satellite on top of one of them and flew it around America, and that upset America something rotten. Then the Russians did it again with a man. They put Yuri Gagarin into one and fired him up, and he went around the Earth twice, and America couldn't believe it. America don't have the option of coming second to anybody. So they said, okay, what can we do to demonstrate our superiority? Right. Land a man on the moon. This was said by President Kennedy in May 1961, 6 weeks after Gagarin's flight, before any American had been into space, bar Alan Shepard, who'd gone 60 miles up and 60 miles down. They didn't know they could do it, but that was what they said they were going to do. They had 9 years to achieve it. Kennedy was killed 2.5 years later. To honor their dead president's challenge, they had to do it. No ifs, buts or maybes, no missed deadlines. The deadline was set. They had to do it. If they couldn't make it, what were they going to do? They were going to fake it. They were going to call on the likes of filmmakers, they were going to call on set dressers, they were going to call on special effects artists, computer scientists, anybody who could help them get the world to believe that they had achieved Kennedy's challenge. That's all they had to do. They had to get the world to believe it. So I come along and challenge some of this for very good reason, that the photographs just don't match up to the conditions we're told they were taken in, with a camera that was being used that couldn't do the job that we're told it did. And I get shot down because I'm saying something which is not acceptable to people who would like to believe it happened. Okay, if you like to believe it happened, tell me why I'm wrong. Don't attack me personally, because that
it has to be about the evidence and not emotions.
If you would indulge in ad hominem attacks, attack me personally, you've demonstrated one thing: you've lost the argument.
Yes.
That's all.
Well, yes, because you have to discuss what's there in front of you, not just how you feel about
the evidence.
And I think that's very important with conspiracy theories in general, is that people who attack them often will attack the person, or they will just attack the genre of conspiracy theory without ever addressing the actual evidence. That's particularly true when it comes to 9/11 theories, for instance. They never will engage with the real evidence. They will just go for the, you know, the typical straw man argument.
Yeah, it's a straw man argument.
But before we move on from NASA, another text here, and somebody's saying here, forgive me if I don't know your name, they don't always come up. It says here, leaving the technical issues aside, how is it that when we can barely afford to even get a new mission to the moon going now, how did they even afford it in the 60s? And, you know, why haven't we gone back? The classic question. And, of course, there's much talk of going back, and maybe it'll be the Chinese or the Indians that will do it. But, you know, what was the problem? Or why is it that we could do it in the 60s and not now? What's your feeling about that?
In the 60s, we're told it cost $120 billion, which is the equivalent of about 500 billion today. It's a lot of money. And it was all spent here on Earth. Not 1 cent, 1 penny, $1 was spent in space. It was all spent here on Earth. So I don't see the argument that it's a waste of money. It employed tens of thousands of people. 400,000 was the total employed by NASA at the height of the Apollo program. We can't afford to do it now, which is a very good excuse for saying we don't know how to do it now. The plans for Apollo, the plans for the lunar landers, the lunar rovers, were all destroyed. The tools, the dyes, the production lines were destroyed.
So it's got to be done from scratch.
It's got to be done from scratch.
Because, of course, President Obama cancelled the Constellation project, didn't he?
He cancelled that.
He didn't seem to think it was that feasible or sensible at that time.
I think his advisors were quite right. There was no point in doing it. Now, at this point, I'm sure somebody, and I hope they do, will mention the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the unmanned satellite currently orbiting the moon and photographing its surface in great detail, using 21st century technology. The technology that can read a newspaper headline from space. That's what spy satellites can do here on Earth.
And they show some objects there that may or may not be the lunar debris from the astronauts, don't they? But of course, the problem we have, isn't it, until you actually stand on that surface and you see them there in the exact positions, A, Photoshop's very good these days, or B, even if the objects are there, that doesn't mean, of course, that the photos and videos that we are shown were actually taken down there on the surface.
Exactly.
So that's not going to be answered anytime soon. But listen, we've got to break there for a second. We'll be back very soon. See you there.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine. On the Edge, in association with Uncensored Magazine.
Okay.
Welcome back to On the Edge for the final part of this show. Now, we've had a text which says that the television programmes are Mythbusters and Fact or Fake, that I understand you know something about. Now, they both concluded that the lunar missions couldn't have been faked because, quote, NASA would never do that. Now, what's your take on that?
Of course NASA
would they do it, would they?
Of course NASA would never admit to it. They would never do. And to be fair to NASA, and a lot of good people do work for NASA, they only work for NASA because that's what they want to do. I would doubt very much if there is any individual working for NASA today who was working there in the late 1960s. Doubt it very much indeed. When their PR chap was interviewed about 10 years ago by David Percy on behalf of his DVD, What Happened on the Moon, he was asked the questions that we've been looking at and talking about today. And he was asked why he didn't investigate these legitimate questions. And his response, and I quote him verbatim, "I have no time for this nitpicky claptrap." This is from NASA. So you can see why...
It doesn't really help,
It doesn't really help. Now, the Mythbusters program, very good program in many respects, did look at the Apollo moon landings. And they did look at the photographs. The one point I would make is that they used a digital camera as opposed to a film camera.
So what, they were trying to reproduce the
They were
anomalies,
trying to reproduce
but
the objects.
using the wrong kind of technology.
Yeah. And they were saying that, of course, you would get reflections. Now, a digital camera records light quite differently from a film camera.
As well, yes.
Much more sensitive. Each individual pixel is almost recorded individually. So where you've got a low light level, which you think is low light level, to a digital camera, it's actually quite a high light level. It can record it. If you try to recreate these images using a digital camera, you will get what you're looking for.
And I mean, you know, we are talking here only about the images. There's some other evidence worth talking about. Can we have a look at image 106? And this is a still image from the famous footage of one of the lunar landers ascending back up into orbit. Now,
this is Apollo 17.
I understand there are issues around the visibility of rocket exhaust. Now,
yes.
What can you tell us about this?
The fuel used on, this is the two parts of the lunar lander. The bottom part is the takeoff pad that stays on the moon, and apparently there are photographs of it available on the web today, taken a couple of years ago. The top half is where the astronauts are, and that is taking off to return to the orbiting command module and ship and then come back to Earth. And in order to take off, it had to fire its rocket. And the rocket fuel used was hydrazine and, anyway, it's two chemicals which, when they're brought together, explode with no ignition source. They explode because the chemicals do it. The same fuel used on the space shuttle.
Well, which is very interesting. We happen to have a picture of the space shuttle. Could we see 107, please?
107.
So here is a shuttle, so firing exactly the same kind of exhaust we should have seen in the previous picture.
And if you ever listen to any transmission from the space shuttle, when it's firing its... these are the small thrusters which position the space shuttle in orbit. They're not the big rockets which get it there.
But the point is we can very clearly see the exhaust here in the space.
And when those go off, it goes off like a rifle shot. It's an explosion, because that's what they do. You bring the two chemicals together, they explode, and that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a visual image. On the moon, we saw no visual image.
Nothing. There's nothing coming out of the bottom of that at all, is there? And yet it would have been like several £1,000s worth of thrust, presumably.
Yeah, because space shuttle's quite big. It has to be manoeuvred. The top section of the Apollo lander weighs probably 5 tons. By the time it's left its bottom bit there, it's got a bit of fuel on board. It's got 2 astronauts, a few bits of rock, a few other things, and it's going back. It still takes a bit to get it off, but there's no visible flame. Why is there no visible flame? It's not because it's in a vacuum. The space shuttle's in a vacuum of space.
And there we can see it.
There is something really odd.
I mean, there is so much we could say about the NASA missions, but listen, we have obviously limited time, and I would like to speak just a little bit more with you about your observations about ancient technology. So we've seen some of the anomalies there with modern technology, or relatively modern. Yeah. So let's go back. You have a few other images to share with us. What should we see?
Image number 117. This.
So it looks like a huge paw print. What are we seeing here, Marcus?
What we're looking at here is a piece of granite in the Cairo Museum. I photographed it when I visited Egypt, and what we see is the size of a half grapefruit. This piece of rock, it was picked up on the Giza Plateau. Now, if anybody looks at this and is not told it's made of granite, and it's picked up in Egypt and it's several thousand years old, you'd say, well, how was that done? And you'd say, well, it's obvious how it was done. It was a core drill. That's a drill with a circular section, and it drills down on hard material, and there's a core left in the middle, and you can see in the bottom of the picture there's a core left which you break off. You tap it and it breaks off. Granite is very brittle. But how do you drill granite? Now, that has been drilled. That piece of granite, size of a half grapefruit, has been drilled.
Wouldn't it? Yes.
What material could possibly drill into granite? There's only one. Diamond is the only mineral which will cut granite. No diamonds in Egypt, to my knowledge, have ever been discovered.
So no remains of any diamond cutting tool, nothing?
Yeah. I mean, that's how we cut it today. We'd use a diamond drill and it would cut it very easily.
So what's the official explanation of how they cut it? What did they use to cut it in the official Egyptologist sense of history?
They will say that it was using a copper core drill and using sand dripped down as the cutting material. Now, technically that is correct. Sand will eventually cut granite, because sand and granite are more or less the same thing. They're quartz, they're mica, they're feldspar. That's what granite is. Sand is basically ground up bits of granite. And if you rotate this drill, you can do it on a post, and you put like a bow drill, and you do it backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. You have to do it for hours to do one of those.
Yeah, has anybody ever tried?
They have tried.
And have they replicated this kind of marking at all?
They haven't replicated the marking. It's not probably possible to see it on here, but you can see the point. We
can just pop back to the image for a second.
Go back to the image. There is, on the centre of the three on the back, there is evidence of grooves being cut at about 1 millimetre apart. Grooves being cut in the granite. Using a bow drill and sand would not produce that image. Anybody who's familiar with the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid will know there is in there a huge box of granite, a sarcophagus.
Yes.
It's about 8 foot long and it's about 3 foot deep, and there are drill marks similar to that, drill marks visible on that. And that piece of granite, by the way, in the King's Chamber, is too big to go through the only entrance into the King's Chamber. It had to have the pyramid built around it. I don't know why. But to cut granite is a very specific technology. Today we can do it easily. That's not a problem. If we can just look possibly finally at image 118, this will show the big size of granite. These are granite, but this is a place very few people even heard of, let alone have visited. It's called the Osarian at Abydos, which is 2 hours' drive north of Luxor. It's supposed to be where Osiris was laid to rest. And you'll notice in this strange place, which is made of granite blocks brought from Aswan, 300 miles south of Luxor, in this strange place there are pools of water. And on other images, which I don't have here, you can see that it's usually the floor of this is normally covered in about a foot of water. So the water's height varies. And when I visited there, in one of the pools at the back was a catfish. The water is connected to the Nile, which is about 5 miles away, and that's why the levels go up and down. The technology to do that is extraordinary. Around the edge at the back there, where the door is, which incidentally is cut a very specific height, the granite blocks have been cut to allow the height of the door to achieve. They haven't just built the blocks up to put a big lintel across, they've cut the door. How did they do that? Again, you start asking these questions and you don't get the answers. So the Egyptologists, they may be able to tell you what colour underpants the pharaoh was wearing and what sort of flowers the dancing girls had in their hair and what bread tasted like, but they won't tell you how you cut granite.
Now, do I get the feeling from that you have strong feelings about Egyptologists?
I do have strong feelings because I don't think
they probably have strong feelings about you as well.
I don't doubt that for a minute. They don't do their job. They don't examine the evidence. They witter on about basically it may be consequential to them, but it's inconsequential to understanding the mystery that we see in ancient Egypt. We see the Great Pyramids, we see the temples at Luxor, we see the incredible place at Aswan, temple to Ramesses II, who lived longer than Queen Elizabeth has lived, by the way. Long, long time. And they don't answer the question, well, how do you build a pyramid 450 foot high with 2 million blocks of sandstone and several hundred tons of granite, which are laid into a room, the King's Chamber, 150 foot above ground level? We can lift 50-ton blocks of granite today, but why would we bother? We'd cut them up and do it a little bit at a time. In Egypt, they used 70-ton blocks of granite, 150 foot up in the air, because they could. Why?
Well, why
Was the pyramid an energy-generating machine? Egyptologists will tell you one thing, it's a tomb, it buried pharaohs, we know who the pharaoh was, it was Cheops. Look, there's his face on the Sphinx, we know who it is. Move along here, nothing more to see.
Would you say that one of your roles, if you wish, was to play devil's advocate as much as anything? Because I mean, I sometimes find myself thinking that you sometimes will throw something in left field almost deliberately to get a reaction.
Isn't it fun?
Is this true, or is this a slander?
Yes, I would challenge if somebody comes along with an explanation which has credence, credibility, and integrity. Yeah, I would like to see it. But when people try to, attack me as an individual, put up the straw man arguments, and not address the question, then I get a little bit peeved and start throwing in devil's advocate type questions.
And we should say you're very fair here, because you don't just do that to the establishment. I've been at conferences where you've got up and given a speaker quite a hard time if you feel they're being glib or they're not explaining themselves. You know, you certainly don't hold back in your views, but did you think that's one of the kind of very things that in a way has led you to reach more mainstream? I mean, as I remember, you actually got the better of Jeremy Clarkson when you were on his show.
Jeremy Clarkson's a lovely guy. He's a very good interviewer, by the way. He appears to be a bit of a buffoon. He's actually very, very clever. You wouldn't maintain the position he's maintained in television and in industry without it, and he wouldn't be lent the cars he bangs around.
But nonetheless, I mean, you know,
he's clever.
You see him demolish anybody that you know, is in any way a fool. And I thought that in that case, you certainly held your own very well. And indeed, Johnny Vaughan. I remember you on the Johnny Vaughan breakfast show, and
the big
you did very well, because I think you have a knack, it would seem, of putting forward stuff that's very hard to actually just brush aside. And as you say, part of the problem we have is you're raising perfectly valid questions, but you're not getting valid answers. Maybe that's where your fire comes from.
That probably sums it up pretty well. That, yes, I may be wrong. I may be completely wrong. Maybe the Egyptians could do all these things very easily.
But show you how.
But show me how. At least demonstrate with our 21st century technology how they did it. And nobody's ever done that, let alone drill a piece of granite with sand. I mean, you know, somebody has done it. It took forever.
Well, yes, that is the time as much as anything.
But that is not an explanation. That is a theory. Yes, it could be done with sand.
Well, we'll have to close down very shortly, very sadly, because there's so much more that we could say. But, I mean, as, if you like, you know, a bit of a trailblazer in the world of conspiracy theory, would you have any advice for anybody who's coming in new to all of this and it's almost overwhelming? They don't know where to start. You know, apart from reading Nexus magazine, before you say it, and indeed Uncensored magazine, where would you start? How to approach this overwhelming world of uncertainty that suddenly descends on you?
If you're listening to it, if you're listening to what we're saying tonight, I've been 40 years looking at it. The first book I ever read, if you like, on conspiracies, was a book called The New Unhappy Lords by A.K. Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton's son. And that started me off. Eric von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods. A lot of people will claim him as their inspiration to start off. And one point about Eric von Daniken, he never said they were UFO landing sites. He said they might be, because he was a brilliant publicist. He sold 60 million copies of his books. He's laughing all the way to the bank. And people have totally misinterpreted it. Read Chariots of the Gods. Read Graham Hancock's book, Fingerprints of the Gods. Read any book that takes your interest, because you have to start, to get here, you have to start somewhere. It doesn't matter where you start where you're interested. If you're interested in UFOs, start with UFOs. Read any decent book on UFOs. If you're interested in crop circles, read Andy's book. If you're interested in looking at what subjects you can study, look at Andy's book.
And how do you deal with the attacks? Very briefly, a few seconds, if somebody has a go at you, how do they deal with that? Because they do get ridiculed sometimes when it's new to them. What would you say to that?
If I'm not ridiculed, I don't think I'm making the correct, decent enough argument. I would say, just listen. You know, if you can't take it, you can't deal it out. You've got to be able to take it as well as deal it out.
Well, Marcus, you've, I think, done exactly that over the years. You've taken a lot of stuff, but you've also given a lot of stuff out. Thank you, everybody, so much for watching. I'd like to thank Marcus for coming along. He's been fantastic. Next programme is Brian Gerrish, who's going to have his very own style. I've been Andy Thomas. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
On the Edge, in association with Uncensored magazine.